Ontario voters will head to the polls later this week, but that snap election isn't the only thing we're tracking. In just 2 weeks' time, the Liberal Party will vote on its new leader and Canada's next Prime Minister, for however long or short that is. And that could see Canadians head to the polls in a federal election sooner rather than later. So where do the polls stand in all three of those races? Eric Grenier is a polls and elections analyst on his website, writ.ca. He's also managing the CBC's poll tracker. And David Coletto is the founder and CEO of Abacus Data. A reminder that polls vary by methodology and results, of course, and are statements of opinion or intention only, which is why we bring in smart people like these two gentlemen to help us understand trend lines and what we should take away from polls. I want to start with Ontario because that election is on Thursday. It does look, by all accounts, as though Doug Ford is still going to hold on to his majority. Eric, are you seeing anything interesting there in terms of what is happening in Ontario?
Boy, that's a tough question. It's something interesting in the Ontario election. It is pretty much the same trend lines that we've seen from the beginning of the campaign. It is pretty flat. The PCs have been leading throughout. Some of the polling that we've seen at the end of the campaign suggests that maybe the gap between the Liberals and the NDP has widened a little bit, that the Liberals have a much better chance of finishing second in the seats than might have been the case at the beginning of the campaign, but really not much has changed. And if anything, Doug Ford is still in a strong position to win a majority government and get a bigger one than last time, which is what he set out to do with this campaign. And that does seem to be where it's going to end up on election night.
It has, David, been sort of a staggeringly boring kind of campaign, which I think is probably what Doug Ford was looking for, to try and just get through and perhaps get the biggest majority in the history of Ontario.
Well, I think it's been boring and uneventful because Donald Trump has basically sucked the oxygen out of every room, including the rooms of the opposition parties in Ontario, who have just tried to get some attention and get the public to focus on anything other than the threat that he poses to the Ontario economy and the Canadian one. And so whether you're Bonnie Crombie, the Liberal leader, Marit Stiles, the NDP leader, you've been trying to get the public out of that frame, but to no avail. And as a result, when we ask people in our polling, which of the leaders is best able to deal with Trump, Doug Ford comes out well ahead. And so he called this election knowing that was likely to be the case. And I think he's going to pull off, his third majority government victory.
Okay, let's move to the Liberal leadership race. I'll start with you on this one, David. So obviously, this is interesting because you're tracking a handful of candidates against a Conservative leader, and it can show different things. But give me a sense of what you're seeing when it comes to the Liberal leadership race.
Well, I think we know two things. One is that Mark Carney has a relatively good favorable rating when you ask Canadians how do you feel about him compared to the other two main candidates, Karina Gould or Chrystia Freeland. He's getting more well known, and I was just looking at the numbers just before our chat. 1 in 5 of those who voted Conservative in the last election say they like Mark Carney. So he has the ability to bring in people who may not have voted Liberal in quite some time, and I think that's really his appeal.
And Eric, Donald Trump is also a big factor in that campaign, obviously, and Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland are seizing on it, but obviously not working as effectively for Chrystia Freeland, it doesn't seem.
No, it doesn't seem that way. All the polls that we've seen of Liberal voters or just the general population, Chrystia Freeland is way behind Mark Carney. We don't really know how Liberal members are going to vote, so that could be very different. But whenever we've seen polls, if you substitute Mark Carney's name in or Chrystia Freeland's name in as leader of the Liberals, Carney does way better than Freeland. Freeland doesn't really give the Liberals any extra bonus there. I think that what Donald Trump has done in that leadership race is that it has made, I think, Canadians want someone maybe serious. And in some of the polls that we've seen, when they do have that hypothetical leader matchup between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, it is in not all the polls, but in a lot of them, it is a dead heat between the two of them. So if he does become the leader on March 9th, and there's an election very shortly afterwards, it could be a much more competitive election than I think any of us were expecting at the beginning of the year.
Okay, and I want to get to the big picture in a minute, but I want to ask you both, and I'll start with you, Eric, about leadership debates. So there's an English one and a French one this week, Monday and Tuesday. Obviously, we'll cover them, and they'll be super interesting. But do leadership debates affect popularity? Does anyone watch those things other than all of us, Eric?
Well, I think that the people who are registered to vote in this are going to watch it. So I think that this debate is probably a much more potentially impactful one than we have during a general election when people might not be as tuned in. And I think that it is much more of a case where the people who are going to be voting in the leadership race are going to be looking to see how mostly Mark Carney performs, I would say, to see if he's up to it, because the polls have been really positive for him. But a lot of it is based, I think, on that reputation, on what people think they think about Mark Carney. So I really think those two debates are going to be pretty important. And French one is going to be especially important because I don't think we have a really good indication of how well he's going to perform in the French language.
Also to see, David, I'm interested to see anyway, how he responds to being poked and criticized and attacked by the other candidates, because that's sort of what an election is like. And so how he handles those kinds of things.
Well, it's the most important question is how does he respond when he's, not in a more controlled setting? And I think that's what a debate does. So, there may not be, maybe there will be, but unlikely millions and millions of people tuning in. But if there is a moment that either the Conservatives or one of his opponents in that leadership race can pick up and share on social media, that is one of the potential outcomes.
Okay, let's talk about the federal polling. You've both mentioned it. David, Conservatives still leading. They would still win an election if it were held today, if I understand. But give me a sense of where things are at right now.
Well, I think the landscape's just changing. And what I've been watching very closely is less the horse race and more of like, what's the question that Canadians are thinking about as they ponder their political choices. And, only a few months ago, it was overwhelmingly change. Give me change, anything but Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. And I think a growing number of Canadians are saying, actually, it's not so much about change. Change is nice, and I'm going to get change likely because we're going to have a new prime minister. But it's much more about the threat that Donald Trump is posing to me, my life, my family. And so I do think a growing number of Canadians are actually asking themselves, which of the parties and which of the leaders are going to protect me the most? And that's a frame that the Liberals can actually compete on, because among those who say Donald Trump is one of their top issues, the Liberals are actually ahead in our polling by 9 or 10 points. The one issue, they actually have an advantage. So the more that people are thinking that, I think the more competitive the next federal election is going to be.
So what is striking you, Eric, from what you're seeing in terms of trend lines?
Well, two things. One is that it has shifted as dramatically as it has. And over just really 6-7 weeks, we've gone from, the Conservatives being able to win 230 seats to now it's an open question whether they could actually win a majority government. On the whole, the consensus in the polls would be that the Conservatives can still win a majority. But the fact that it's even a possibility now with the trend lines that we've seen that maybe they could fall short of that is a huge change from where things were when Justin Trudeau resigned. And also the other story that I find we might not be paying as much attention to is that as the Liberal numbers have gone up in the polls, the Conservatives come down a little, but the NDP has really, really tanked. And in some of the polls, we've seen that they could be in the low teens. We're looking at numbers that we haven't seen from the NDP since the 1990s, with Audrey McLaughlin and Alexa McDonough. And I think that actually adds fuel to the fire for the Liberals to maybe want to go to the polls early, because while the race is still competitive with the Conservatives lead in all the polls, and they have more support than they had in the last election. The Liberals can take advantage of the fact that the NDP could be cut in half in terms of not only its support, but also the amount of seats it has. So that is another factor that could contribute to the Liberals feeling a little bit bullish on going to the polls, even in a situation where the Conservatives have the advantage.
Okay. David, Eric, thank you. I love talking to both of you. You're both so smart about this stuff. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary.
You can go check out the CBC News poll tracker to get a picture of what polls across the country are showing. It was updated just today. Eric did that for us. Every publicly available poll is included, and it looks at sample size, timing, and more to gauge support among viewers. Super helpful if you're trying to get a sense of where things are at.